Insights of All Trades podcast.
Before we started this podcast, Cole and I were talking back and forth that, man, we don't really know anything about politics or what's going on, and especially at the state level. So what do you recommend to people, to Cole and I, and people like us? How should we get our information? Because there's a lot of stuff out there that you hear about. News media are very biased toward one side or the other. What do you recommend for people like us that, we want the information, we want to be informed, but where do we go? We're so lost.
I am opinionated about this issue. I don't think you should start with your national news media. So, not to pick a side, but CNN and Fox are not the places to go for your news because...
Oh, man.
Right.
Yeah,
because
very polarized.
Yes, because it's not that you only hear one side. You will hear the news. But they use language in a way that does effectually make you only hear one side. And unfortunately, about 80% of Americans get their news from these sources. And there's newspapers doing it too. So I'm trying to think of... Actually, the Wall Street Journal's not so bad because a lot of Americans trust them. But if you're reading the New York Times, for example, they just use different language. So I'll go back to Fox News or CNN because I like printed media. But Fox and CNN, they'll tell you the same story, but they'll use different words that basically mean you're only hearing one side of the issue. And I think that's bad. So, again, I think you should go to a lot of primary sources. So, if you hear about this blank happening to someone, go to the person that it happened to and ask how they felt about it. I think a lot can be learned from simple human conversations. I will always plug local media. I think the Sentinel, their editorials, for example, are conservative in nature, but the state and national news that they print is often Associated Press prints. And they do a good job of just telling you what's going on without telling you what to believe or anything like that. And to be honest, I am apologist for Twitter. A lot of people, I don't do social media really. I have a weird lurker Instagram account where I look at my friends and family. And I actually, because of my public position now, I took down my private Facebook page. So now I only have my campaign and legislative pages. But I am a big fan of Twitter because oftentimes you can learn about a news story before it actually hits the national spin cycle and the 24-hour news cycle. And you can kind of hear the unvarnished what really happened before anything else. And you hear a lot of takes on Twitter as well.
Yeah, you open up the comments section.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you might hear the story and then it might get ratioed, which on Twitter means it might have 50 favorites and 1,000 comments. But you get the raw, unvarnished what actually happened. And it's either a person having a take on something or whether it's the actual news story. I heard about for example, the Charlottesville protests where somebody died a few years ago, and they're white nationalists, and then the president made his comment that was insensitive. I knew about all that happening since Twitter, and I got to see it in real time. I got to see what happened in Charlottesville, and then the president's reaction, rather than hearing, Tucker Carlson defending the president on Fox or Anderson Cooper blasting him on CNN. You got to see what actually happened for yourself, and I got to decide for myself. So I defend Twitter. There's a lot of toxicity on Twitter that happens as well.
But it also comes back to who do you actually follow on Twitter? Because you could still follow Fox News or CNN and get your news that way. But how do you get these more local media? How do you pick and choose who to follow there?
So a lot of your local sources have a lot of good reporting. So I follow the Sentinel, and then I follow a lot of Harrisburg sources. Again, Harrisburg things aren't always partisan. They sometimes are. But I follow the local public news station, and there's a lot of reporters that are just covering the nuts and bolts of what's happening rather than offering their own take on it. So I do follow a lot of Harrisburg area reporters that, just by virtue of what I do and what they do, they sometimes know what's going on in the legislature before I do. For example, if something's happening in committee hearing A, but I'm sitting in committee hearing B, and I'm not part of that debate, but then I can go to that person later and find out what happened. You can still follow the national news sources, but what I would suggest if you do that is to follow a mix. So for example, I think I stay away from all of those polarized ones, but in terms of the newspapers, I do follow the Wall Street Journal, I follow the New York Times, I follow Washington Post. Just try to get a mix of those different sources so that you're not eating a diet of the same food, so to speak. You're getting a nice balanced food pyramid of news sources.
I think right after this podcast, Nick and I are going to go into your following on, we're just going to destroy the follow button.